In the winter of 1832, a trapper named Ephraim was skinning a beaver along a frozen creek bed in Wyoming's Wind River Range when his knife slipped. The blade caught the meat of his left palm, just below the thumb, barely deep enough to worry about. He wrapped it in a strip of buckskin, flexed his hand a couple times, and went back to work. 3 weeks later, Ephraim was dead. He didn't freeze in a blizzard or get mauled by a grizzly or ambushed by a Blackfoot war party. He died from that cut on his hand, a cut so small he probably forgot about it the same afternoon it happened. The mountain men of the American West trapped beaver across the Rocky Mountains for 20 years, from 1820 to 1840. They survived conditions that would kill most people in a matter of days. And the thing that buried more of them than any blizzard, any grizzly, any war party on horseback was a wound too small to take seriously in a world that had no way to treat it. To understand how that is possible, you need to go back to the Rocky Mountain fur trade of the 1820s and see what these men walked into every single morning. Between 1820 and 1840, roughly 3,000 men roamed the Rocky Mountains of North America trapping beaver. The fur trade was an enormous business driven almost entirely by one thing: fashion. Wealthy Europeans wanted beaver felt hats. The demand was so massive that entire companies were built around getting those pelts out of the mountains and across the Atlantic. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company, the American Fur Company, the Hudson's Bay Company. These were the corporations of their day, and the mountain men were their workforce. But calling them a workforce does not come close to describing what they actually did. These men lived alone or in small groups for months at a time in some of the most dangerous terrain on the continent. The Rocky Mountains in the 1820s had no trails worth following, no maps that meant anything, no supply lines, and no cavalry outpost to ride to when things went sideways. If you ran out of food, you ate roots, tree bark, or boiled your own leather moccasins into a greasy broth and choked it down. If you ran out of gunpowder, you were as good as dead. The men who chose this life were a specific breed. They carried .40 caliber Hawken rifles that could drop a buffalo at 200 yards. They wore suits made of stiffened deer hide that doubled as light armor. They learned to read animal tracks the way a banker reads a ledger, and they could build a shelter out of pine branches and snow in under an hour when a storm rolled in without warning. Take Hugh Glass. In August of 1823, Glass was trapping beaver near the Grand River in present-day South Dakota when he stumbled onto a grizzly bear with cubs. He fired his single-shot musket, but only wounded the animal. Before he could reload, the bear charged. It slashed him open from head to foot, shredded his back, broke his ribs, and tore a gash in his throat so deep that his companions could see muscle and bone. His fellow trappers, including a young Jim Bridger, figured Glass would be dead within hours. 2 men were assigned to stay behind, wait for him to die, and give him a burial. Instead, those 2 men, John Fitzgerald and Bridger, took his rifle, his knife, his flint, and his powder, and left him there alone. Glass did not die. He crawled. For 6 weeks, he dragged himself across 200 miles of open prairie toward Fort Kiowa, eating berries, roots, and raw meat from a dead buffalo calf he found along the way. He set his own broken leg using a stick and strips of hide. He let maggots clean the infection from his wounds because he had seen the Pawnee do it. That is what a mountain man was capable of surviving, crawling 200 miles across open prairie on a broken leg, half his back shredded by a grizzly. But the grizzly bear was not what killed most of these men. The Blackfoot raiding party was not either, and neither was the sub-zero blizzard that swept across the high passes of the Continental Divide every January. What filled the most unmarked graves along the fur trade routes was something so ordinary that the men who died from it never saw it coming. A nick on the finger while skinning a pelt, a thorn puncture through a worn-out moccasin, a rope burn on the wrist from hauling a loaded pack mule up a steep trail, the kind of injuries you would not think twice about today. You would wash it off, put on a bandage, maybe dab some antiseptic on it, and forget about it by dinner time. In the 1820s, in the backcountry of the Rocky Mountains, there was no washing it off. There was no antiseptic. There was no clean cloth for a bandage. There was no doctor within 500 miles. And even if there had been one, the closest thing to medical science in the 1820s was bloodletting and mercury pills, which would have killed you just as fast as the infection. What there was, instead, was buckskin. Mountain men wore it from head to toe because it was durable and offered protection from thorns, brush, and even some weapons. But wet buckskin, and it was always wet because these men spent hours every day wading in freezing mountain streams to set their beaver traps, became a breeding ground for bacteria. The leather pressed directly against open wounds, trapping moisture and filth against raw skin. It was like wrapping your cuts in a dirty sponge and leaving it there for days. Germ theory did not exist yet. Nobody understood that the redness spreading out from a small cut on your hand was an infection traveling through your bloodstream. Nobody understood that the fever and chills that started a week after a minor scratch were the early signs of sepsis. The mountain men had their own explanations. They blamed bad air, bad luck, or curses from the spirits. They treated wounds with whatever was on hand. River mud packed into gashes. Beaver castor, the oily secretion from the animal's glands, smeared onto cuts like a salve. Chewed up roots spit into open wounds by the Native American women who sometimes traveled with them. Some of these remedies actually worked to a degree. Certain roots had mild antiseptic properties. Maggots genuinely cleaned dead tissue from wounds, which is why Hugh Glass survived his mauling at the Grand River. But for every trapper who lucked into a treatment that helped, there were a dozen who packed a wound with creek mud full of Clostridium bacteria and developed tetanus, or gangrene, or blood poisoning that turned their skin black from the fingers to the shoulder in less than a week. When infection set in, there was almost nothing to do but watch it happen. A trapper's companions could see the red streak spreading up his arm from a swollen cut. They could feel the heat radiating off his skin when the fever started. They knew what it meant. Every man in the mountains had seen it before. The wound goes red, then purple. The skin around it swells tight like a drum. The fever hits, and the man starts shaking so hard he cannot hold a cup. Within days, the smell changes. And once you can smell it, the outcome is almost always the same. The lucky ones had friends willing to attempt an amputation with a skinning knife and a handsaw. The unlucky ones, which was the vast majority, just waited it out in a lean-to shelter while their bodies lost the fight inch by inch. Consider Tom Smith, a 26-year-old trapper who entered the northern reaches of Grand County, Colorado in 1827. His group was attacked by a raiding party, likely Ute or Arapaho, and Smith took an arrow to the leg. The arrowhead split the bone and created what the men around him recognized immediately as a life-threatening wound. Amputation was the only option, but not a single man in the party had the nerve or the knowledge to perform it. They tried to treat the wound with what they had. Smith suffered for days before the infection consumed him. That arrow was not a small wound, but the story illustrates the core problem. Even when mountain men recognized that an injury was serious, they had almost no ability to treat it. So imagine what happened with the cuts and scrapes they didn't even recognize as dangerous. And those small wounds were constant. Every single day of a working trapper's life in the Rocky Mountains practically guaranteed new ones. The trapping season was split into two brutal windows. The fall season started as soon as the beaver grew their thick winter coats, typically September, and lasted until the streams froze solid around early November. The spring season picked up the moment the ice broke, usually March, and ran until the fur thinned out in late May. During both windows, a trapper waded knee-deep and sometimes waist-deep into mountain streams that ran just above freezing to set and check his beaver traps. Each man carried 6 to 12 steel traps, weighing about 3.5 pounds each. He had to wade into the water, anchor the trap to a stake driven into the stream bed, and smear a willow stick with beaver castor to lure the animals in. Then he did it again and again. Every single morning, often before dawn, in water cold enough to make his legs go numb within minutes. His hands were in that water for hours, cracked and raw from the constant exposure. The skin split open along the knuckles. His fingertips went white, then red, then stayed swollen for days. And then he picked up his skinning knife and went to work on the beaver carcasses, and the blood from the animals got into every nick and scratch and split on his fingers. At night, he slept in damp buckskin on the ground, often without even a canvas tent, just a blanket and a fire that he might let burn down to coals if he was worried about attracting attention from hostile groups. His immune system, already battered by cold exposure, poor nutrition, and chronic exhaustion, had nothing left to fight off the bacteria colonizing his wounds. Rheumatism was so common among trappers that it was considered a normal part of the job. Their joints swelled, their backs locked up. Men in their 30s moved like men in their 70s, and because they could not stop working, because stopping meant starving, they pushed through it. They trapped with swollen hands. They rode horses with infected blisters on their thighs. They skinned animals with fingers they could barely close. The toughness that kept them alive in the short term is exactly what killed them in the long term. A mountain man's entire identity was built on the idea that pain was something you ignored, that complaining was weakness, that a real man did not stop for a scratch or a sore or a fever. That code, that culture of grinding through everything, turned survivable injuries into death sentences. Then there was the water from the beaver ponds, which quietly opened a second front that most trappers never even knew they were fighting. These men drank directly from the same streams where they trapped beaver. They did not boil it. They did not filter it. They scooped it up in their hands or dipped a tin cup into a still pool below a beaver dam and drank it cold. It tasted clean. It looked clean. The Rocky Mountain streams were fed by snowmelt and spring water, and every trapper assumed it was the purest water on earth. It was not. Beaver are natural carriers of a parasite called Giardia, a microscopic organism that lives in their intestines and passes into the water through their droppings. The same beaver ponds where trappers set their steel-jawed traps were contaminated with the parasite. When the trappers drank from those ponds, they ingested it. The result was a condition they called the trapper's trots, but which modern medicine calls giardiasis, more commonly known as beaver fever. Severe diarrhea, stomach cramps, nausea, and dehydration that could last for weeks. In a modern hospital, it is treatable and rarely fatal. In the 1830s Rockies, without clean water or medicine, it was devastating. A man already weakened by cold exposure and infected wounds who developed beaver fever was in serious trouble. His body could not fight on two fronts. The dehydration sapped whatever strength he had left, and the infection in that small cut on his hand, the one he had forgotten about, was now spreading through a body that had no defenses remaining. That is the cascade that killed more mountain men than the blizzards or the grizzlies or the war parties ever did. A chain of small failures, starting with a wound too minor to worry about, compounding through contaminated water and a wrecked immune system until the body simply gave out. If you're finding this interesting, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten history like this every week, because the men who survived the longest were the ones who figured out how to break that chain somewhere, and the most reliable way to break it had nothing to do with European medicine. Several of the Rocky Mountain tribes, particularly the Crow, the Shoshone, and the Nez Perce, had developed wound care traditions over centuries that were far more effective than anything a trapper could have gotten from a white doctor back east. The Crow were known to make poultices from yarrow, a flowering plant that grows wild across the northern Rockies. Yarrow contains compounds that reduce bleeding, fight inflammation, and slow bacterial growth. The Shoshone used wild sage in a similar way, grinding the leaves into a paste and pressing it directly against open wounds. Other tribes used wild comfrey, which promotes tissue repair, or pine resin, which creates a natural seal over a cut that keeps dirt and moisture out. These were not folk remedies based on superstition. They were practical treatments developed through generations of observation and refinement, and they worked. A trapper who knew to clean a wound with boiled water and pack it with a yarrow poultice had a dramatically better chance of surviving the winter than one who smeared river mud on it and wrapped it in wet buckskin. The trappers who gained access to this knowledge were usually the ones who married Native American women. This was common practice in the fur trade. Men like Jim Beckworth, who lived among the Crow for years and married into the tribe, or John Coulter, who traveled extensively with the Shoshone, benefited from medical knowledge that their peers simply did not have. Their wives and in-laws taught them which plants to use, how to prepare them, and when a wound was getting dangerous enough to need real attention. In a world where the difference between life and death was often whether you treated a cut with yarrow or creek mud, this knowledge was worth more than a year's supply of beaver pelts. The deep irony is that European medicine at the time was actively making things worse. The standard treatments a doctor in St. Louis or Philadelphia would have prescribed in 1830 included bloodletting, which weakened an already sick patient, mercury-based pills that caused organ damage, and purging with emetics that dehydrated the body even further. A mountain man who somehow made it to a frontier doctor's office might have been better off staying in the Rockies and letting a Shoshone woman treat him with sage and yarrow. But most trappers never had access to either option. They worked in small groups of 2 or 3 deep in the backcountry, days or weeks from the nearest camp. When a cut got infected, they were on their own. And the numbers tell the story plainly. The unmarked graves scattered across those Rocky Mountain passes add up fast. Jedediah Smith, one of the most legendary mountain men in American history, reported that over a 6-year period, his company employed about 180 men. 94 of them died, more than half. And while many fell to violence, a staggering number died from wounds and illness that should not have been fatal. Smith himself nearly died in 1823 when a grizzly tore his scalp loose from his skull, shredded his ear, and ripped open his side. His fellow trapper, Jim Kleiman, sewed the scalp back on with a needle and thread, without anesthesia or antiseptic of any kind. Kleiman told Smith afterward that there was nothing he could do about the ear. Smith told him to try anyway. Kleiman stitched it back on as best he could. Smith survived, but the fact that he survived a grisly mauling while other men in his company died from infected blisters tells you everything about how random and ruthless frontier medicine was. Your survival depended less on the severity of the wound and more on whether the specific bacteria that got into it happened to be the kind your body could fight off on its own. It was a lottery, and most of the men pulling tickets had already burned through their luck. By the late 1830s, the mountain man era was ending anyway. European fashion had shifted. Silk hats replaced beaver felt practically overnight, and the demand for pelts collapsed. The Hudson's Bay Company, operating out of Canada, had already been undercutting American fur prices for years, selling manufactured trade goods at rates no American outfit could match. The Rocky Mountain Fur Company went bankrupt. The American Fur Company followed. The annual rendezvous, those legendary summer gatherings at places like the Green River Valley in Wyoming and Pierre's Hole in Idaho, where 500 men would trade furs, drink raw whiskey, hold shooting and wrestling contests, and gamble away a year's earnings in a single night, stopped happening after 1840. The last one just fizzled out, with the quiet realization that there was nobody left to sell beaver pelts to. By 1846, only about 50 American trappers were still working the Snake River country in what is now southern Idaho. The rest had died, gone home broken and arthritic, or reinvented themselves as Army scouts, wagon train guides, and frontier traders. Men like Kit Carson and Jim Bridger parlayed their mountain knowledge into second careers guiding settlers along the Oregon Trail, selling their expertise to the waves of families heading west. The mountain men opened the American West. They mapped the passes, named the rivers, and established the trails that would carry a nation from the Mississippi to the Pacific. Their courage and endurance are beyond question, but their story carries a lesson that hits harder because of that toughness. The wilderness didn't need a blizzard or a grizzly or a war party to kill a mountain man. All it needed was a small cut and a man too stubborn to take it seriously. Toughness is not the same thing as invincibility. Ignoring a wound does not make it go away. It makes it worse. And in a place without a hospital or a doctor or a second chance, the smallest mistake you refuse to acknowledge becomes the one that buries you. The Rockies did not care how brave you were. The bacteria did not care how many bears you had fought. And the creek water you drank every morning did not care that you thought it was clean. The dumb mistake was not a single dramatic failure. It was the quiet daily decision to treat your own body like it was indestructible, in a world that proved over and over again that it was not. Ephraim's grave, if anyone ever marked it, is somewhere along those frozen creek beds in the Wind River Range. He survived 2 full seasons in the Rockies. He could set traps in water cold enough to turn his legs purple, read the sky for storms, and outwork any man in his brigade. And in the end, a half-inch cut on his palm was all it took. If this one got you thinking, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, and if you want to see how frontier survival tactics compare to what modern outdoorsmen know today, that video is on screen right now.